Have you lost your minds? Said the lead guardsman. Where do you think you're going with that char? Dougal looked around him. Riona stood stock still, her hands gripping the chain linked to Ember's manacles. The char was equally quiet, but Dougal saw that her leg muscles were bunched for a sudden fight. Colleen, always accommodating, smiled and raised both arms. Gullick crossed his, scowled, but said nothing. Officers, said Dougal, raising both hands in front of him as if to ward off an expected blow. We have a good explanation for this. Explanations later, said the officer. Hand over that prisoner. Now, hand it over. Dougal looked at Riona. She bit her lower lip, then offered him the char's chains. Very well, then. Ember's eyes went wide and white, and Dougal was sure the char was going to try and bolt. She would not make it 10 feet before the riflemen on the walls cut all of them down. The Asura running the gate stepped between Ember and the officer. Just a moment, Lieutenant. What are you doing with my property? Your property, Master Cranks? Said the officer, towering over the small Asura, but no longer reaching out for the chain. Why are you smuggling a char into Evanhawk? My studies, of course, said Cranks. Your superiors keep pressing me for new and better ways to kill char. I hired these... He waved a small hand at Dougal's group, searching for a word. Individuals to bring me a living, breathing representative of the race. We could have brought you char, said the lieutenant. We have more than enough of them outside our walls. You didn't hear me, said Cranks. I need one alive and breathing. The ones you bring in are usually in poor condition. Dougal shot a look at Ember. She was no longer as panicked. She was, however, angry. Why would you bring a char here? In the middle of the night? Asked the lieutenant. Idiot of a human, said Cranks. Can you imagine the riot that would ensue if I brought a live char in with regular supplies from Divinity's Reach? I suggested it, of course, but your commander Samuelson would not hear of it. Samuelson knows about this, said the guard. Of course, lied the Asura, without missing a beat. You think I would do something like this without checking up the line? You humans care too much about the chain of command for your own good, you know. Let's go wake up your commander Samuelson in the wee hours of the morning, and I'm sure he'll be glad to send me on my way, and then have a nice long discussion with you about the perils of personal initiative. The guard's face hardened. What are your intentions with this char? Vivisection, said Cranks, and Ember jumped in surprise, almost pulling the chain out of Riona's hands. Gullick put a heavy hand on the char's shoulder and let out a deep, throaty warning. The lieutenant nodded and said, And you're going to keep it in your workshop? I have a cage prepared for it, said the Asura. If you want, I can make a rug out of its skin for you when I'm done. Very well, said the officer. Olsen, Gregory, escort Master Cranks to his workshop and stand guard outside. I'll send relief in the morning. Excellent, said the Asura, and motioned to Dougal and Riona. You lot, bring the prisoner and follow along. I have much to do before sunrise. As they walked away under the watchful eyes of the heavily armed ebon vanguard on the walls, Dougal started to say, That was very... Silence! Snapped the Asura, raising a hand to hush Dougal, but not missing a step with the two guards. Don't talk. Watch the prisoner. I don't want it to bolt now before I get a chance to peel back its ribs. Dougal fell back alongside Riona, wondering if he was dealing with one of Clagg's relatives. They trod through the cobblestone streets of Evanhawk, and even in the darkness, Dougal felt a pang of homesickness. The streets were empty, and the night shutters of the upper stories bolted tight. Curfew was still in force, as it had been in his youth. There was no one visible on the streets, but Dougal knew that the alleyways were alive, with sneak thieves looking for targets and teenagers daring the wrath of the authorities. He had done both in his time. The buildings and walls were mostly of grey stone, carved in the quarries behind the city and shaped to fit together like pieces of a puzzle. The upper floors were whitewashed, but in daylight were a dingy grey from the regular dust storms that blew up from the south. In the wan moonlight, they were as pale as phantoms. Still, here was an old storefront he used to visit, and there was the fountain he remembered, and last was the tavern, where he and Dak and Jervis and Vala and Marga would gather after patrol. He thought of them all, in that pale, dead city, and his heart sank again. He looked at the others. Colleen had her hood up, and Garlic looked particularly bored. Ember looked about, possibly scouting for escape routes. His eyes locked with Riona's for a moment, and he saw in them the same sadness that he felt. At last they reached a particularly thick, reinforced door attached to a particularly dingy and windowless building. The guards took up positions on either side of the door as Cranks fumbled with a set of oversized keys. He made a great production of opening no less than 3 sets of locks and swinging the door inward, then stepped aside. To the guards he said, "See you in the morning." To Dougal he said, "You lot, inside! Quit wasting my time!" The group dutifully entered, Ember giving token resistance on her chains and being pushed forward by Gullick. The Asura stood by the door, slammed it after they entered, and re-secured the locks, adding a pair of deadbolts as well. Dougal looked around. The room was small, low-ceilinged. Gullick had to duck to miss the crossbeams, and littered with all manner of anvils, forges, odd-shaped rocks, skulls, glassware, and a variety of tools. What the room missed was the obvious cage that Cranks had mentioned to the Vanguard lieutenant. The Asura finished barring the door and picked up something that looked like an elongated tuning fork. He tapped it against a metal plate, and a bolt of lightning arced between the tines. "I'm going to need you to scream," he said to Ember quietly. Ember looked down at the Asura, her shoulders hunched. "Why should I? We have 2 guards outside who overheard me talking about skinning you," said the Asura. "I do not doubt that one, if not both, have their ears pressed against the door, waiting to hear your screams. We should oblige them." Ember looked angrily at the Asura, then let out a loud snarl. Cranks shook his head. "Pitiful, I said a scream," said Cranks. He smacked the tuning fork against the metal plate again, and it cracked like a lightning bolt, casting harsh shadows over the group behind them. The manacled Char, standing 10 feet away from him, unharmed, scowled. Then she bellowed, "No! I will never submit! Arrgh! Into the cage, beast!" shouted the Asura. "A Char will never! Ah! The pain! My fur! I'm burning!" cried Ember. "You do not know pain yet! Into the cage!" Cranks tapped the fork a 3rd time, and it exploded into a shower of sparks, matched by Ember's own ear-piercing scream. "Throw it in the cage and we can begin," said the Asura. "Yes, Master Cranks!" shouted Gullick enthusiastically. Riona and Ember both looked at the Norn, their mouths open in disbelief. Gullick raised his eyebrows and said, "Just trying to help." "Good!" cried Cranks in triumph. "Now administer the sedative, and we can begin. I want to flay that creature alive." And he calmly set down his lightning fork and said in a low voice, "That was very good, Char. Have you done that professionally?" "I have had my opportunities," said Ember, no longer as panicked as she had once appeared. "Very well," said the Asura, listening for a moment to his door, then nodding to the others. "Come, we should be out of here. Lieutenant Stafford will not dare wake his commander, but you can bet he'll be there in his office with the first dawn's light. And don't touch that!" The last was directed at Gullick, who had reached out for the lightning fork. Cranks pulled a bag from one side of his work table and put the fork into it, along with a couple of flasks of bluish liquid and a couple of other tools. He adjusted a few things on his workbench. He looked around the workshop and let out a sigh, then turned toward a back wall stacked with barrels. He opened one of the barrels, reached in, and pulled a switch, and the entire wall, complete with false barrel fronts, swung outward, revealing a narrow set of stairs descending into the earth. "Follow me," said the Asura, pulling a small gem from his pockets and blowing on it. It glowed with an amber radiance. As he walked down the stairs, other gems set into walls glimmered to life, with wan flames that provided a minimum of guidance. Riona, still holding on to Ember's chain, followed Cranks. Colleen and Gullick went next, and Dougal brought up the rear. He looked around the empty, windowless workshop and thought he heard the sound of cooling metal ticking away as it contracted. He wondered how long the guards outside would be content with listening to a sedated Char behind closed doors. As Dougal worked his way through the passage, he noted that the smaller gemstones were already fading. They walked for what he estimated were 2 city blocks, then turned right and walked another one. Dougal tried to visualize where that put him in the city, but failed. They emerged in a large basement of another building, probably a warehouse, at the top of a ramp. The ramp switched back twice before opening up into a space large enough to be a throne room, but stacked with storage shelves. Little sat on the shelves, but a few basic supplies, plus several slabs of stone and ingots of metal stacked in a haphazard way, all wreathed in shadow. Several half-built golems lay in a pile in one corner, and along one wall was the half-constructed form of an Asura gate. The shelves had been cleared away from the front of the room, the centerpiece of which was a long, circular lab table set at the perfect height for an Asura to work at. Cranks slapped a small panel as he came into the room, and a flame leaped into life under a pot sitting on a metal surface. "Pardon the mess," he said. "I don't often have guests." Ember crinkled her snout as she sniffed at the air. "I can see why," she said. "It smells like something died down here." "No one can prove that," said Cranks, smiling, "and if they can, I wasn't anywhere near here when it happened." He turned to Riona. "Are you in charge here, or were you just the only one willing to hold the char's chain?" Riona nodded indignantly. "While we appreciate your aid, our business here is our own. We must leave this place as soon as possible, by orders of the Queen of Kryta." "Right," Cranks said. "And I'm, really, Master Snaff of Destiny's Edge." "I assume you are the General's man in Ebonhawk?" said Dougal. Cranks sneered at that. "She didn't mention my name? That sounds like Soulkeeper coming and going. She is too clever by half sometimes. Thinks she's running the Order of Whispers or something." "The what?" said Colleen. "Tactician Cranks of the Vigil," said the Asura, quickly introducing himself with a small bow. Returning to Riona, "You're a Crusader. Almora recruits people like you." "We are both Crusaders of the Vigil," said Ember. "I am Ember Doomforge. The human female is Riona Grady, and she speaks the truth. Our mission is on behalf of the Queen of Kryta." Cranks nodded. "Soulkeeper warned me you people might not be too sharp, but when I joined the Vigil, I had no idea that it might ever sink this low. Smuggling a char into Ebonhawk? Has she lost her mind?" Colleen opened her mouth to point out it had been Dougal's idea, but Dougal raised a hand and silently pleaded with her to keep her helpful truths to herself. "What did General Soulkeeper say in her message?" said Riona. "Very little," said Cranks. "Very need to know, she is. Expect visitors that will need to leave Ebonhawk quietly. Some may be problematic." "Problematic!" She is a master of understatement. "And she provided the date and time to reconfigure the gate. That was some mighty arcane kludging, by the way. They're gonna have to recalibrate an entire bank of crystals after that one. Don't touch that either." Garlic had found a pack hanging on a nearby peg intriguing, and looked at the Asura sheepishly as he edged away from it. "Very well," said Riona. "You have gotten us here and past the Ebon Vanguard. Where do we go from here?" "I have to go out and make a few final arrangements," said Cranks. "Plant a few false leads and wrap up some personal business. Then we will go out by the way of the sewers." "Sewers?" said Riona. "We," said Dougal. "We," said Cranks. "After this, I'm burned as an asset, and there will likely be an investigation and some charges regarding using and protecting the Asura Gate as well. Once Commander Samuelson gets up and the lieutenant talks to him, I am going to become a person of interest. So, like it or not, I'm coming with you. Where are we going?" "Ascalon City," said Dougal. Cranks let out a low whistle. "Almora," he said. "You never do anything in halves. Very well then, get a bit of rest, you're going to need it. I will be back, and in the name of the eternal alchemy," he looked at Garlic, "don't touch anything." Garlic looked disappointed, and collapsed onto a pile of sacks in the corner. The sides of one of the sacks split, and potatoes rolled out. Colleen lowered herself down next to him and tried to make herself comfortable using the Norn's pack as a pillow. Ember, held out her manacled hands and let out a low growl. Not yet, said Riona. We aren't out of Ebonhawk. You must be kidding, snarled the Char. We're in a basement. If the Vanguard finds us, we're better off if I can pull my own weight. I don't think so, said Riona. Do it, said Dougal sharply. Ember's right. We are taking all sorts of risks, Riona started again. Unlock her, said Dougal, or I'll fish out my tools and break the locks myself. Riona shot Dougal a hot flash of anger, but pulled the keys from her pouch and tripped the tumblers in Ember's wrist and neck manacles. The Char immediately stretched herself out to her full height, raised her arms, and let out a powerful growl. You have no idea how good that feels, she said. You'd be surprised, said Riona, but Ember ignored her and joined the other two on the pile of potato sacks. Riona turned to Dougal. Her face was bunched with anger and, Dougal thought, a little confusion. Instead, she said, You going to get some rest? I'll stand watch until Tactician Cranks gets back. You froze, said Dougal. At the Asura gate. You were willing to hand over Ember. You would have thought of something, said Riona. But Dougal shook his head. You could have handed over your magic purple-stamped letter, Dougal said pointedly. Orders from the Queen of Kryta and Logan Thackeray. Thackeray's name doesn't hold the weight around here it once did, she said. And as for Queen Jenna, you know that most of us here think that she is distant authority, at best? Dougal ignored her and continued, still keeping his voice down. But instead, you would have handed one of your fellow Crusaders over. A Char Crusader, said Riona, her voice low, but her face flushed. And she knew the risks. Besides the point, said Dougal. Riona was angry now. You remember the other night, when Crusader Doomforge said she would do anything to make sure the mission succeeded, even if it meant the death of one of us? Dougal nodded, and she continued hotly, I feel the same way. If we were going to fight and die there at the gate, the mission would have failed. You know that. Ember knew that. She would have sacrificed herself if she had to. That's how the Vigil operates. We were lucky, said Dougal. You are lucky, said Riona, calming herself. That's why you've survived long enough to come along. And are you really one to lecture me about sacrificing allies? Dougal opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Riona nodded in triumph. Now, if you don't mind, I could use some time away from all of you. And with that, she retreated to the far side of the room and wrapped herself up in her cloak, watching Ember and the others. Gullick was already snoring loudly. Dougal let out a long breath and looked at the brooding Riona at one side of the room and the three non-humans on the other side. He walked up to the low Asura height table and tested it. It seemed strong enough to support a full-grown Norn. Dougal lay down on the tabletop, wrapped himself in his cloak, and was asleep in moments. His sleep must have been dreamless, because the next thing he realised, he was being shaken by the shoulders by a small child. Wake up, you booker, snapped Cranks, rolling off him as Dougal sat up, blinking back his slumber and wondering if he was ever again going to sleep through an entire night. As Cranks's angry face came into focus, he managed a mumbled, What now? Where is she? Said Cranks, and looked over at the others. Colleen was pulling herself to her feet, and Ember was shaking the Norn from his deep slumbers. She? Was all Dougal could manage. The girl, Riona, said Cranks. Whilst you've been sleeping, she's wandered off.